At first, you're obsessed with the idea. You think about it constantly. You imagine the future version of yourself living it. And then, the moment progress actually begins, your motivation disappears. Not slowly, almost instantly. Suddenly, the thing you cared about feels heavy, distant, uninteresting. And you start wondering, if I really wanted this, why did I stop the second it became possible? 2. Problem deep dive. It usually happens quietly. You start project, a routine, a creative idea, a relationship. At first, your mind feels alive around it. You research it late at night, picture where it could lead, feel emotionally attached to the possibility. But then, reality enters the picture. The project becomes real work. The relationship becomes emotionally vulnerable. The dream becomes measurable. And strangely, that's when your energy disappears. Not before progress, after it. Which feels confusing because most people assume motivation disappears from failure. But for you, motivation often disappears from proximity. The closer something gets to becoming real, the harder it becomes to continue. So you begin cycling through unfinished identities. You almost become things, almost build things, almost commit, but never fully arrive. And after enough unfinished attempts, you start developing a painful belief. Maybe I'm just lazy. But deep down, that explanation never fully fits, because laziness usually avoids effort completely. You don't avoid caring. You care intensely, sometimes too intensely. The problem is that imagination feels emotionally safe. Reality doesn't. In imagination, your potential stays untouched, undefined, protected. But once action creates evidence, your identity becomes vulnerable to judgment, including your own. And that changes the emotional meaning of progress entirely. What once felt exciting suddenly starts feeling dangerous. Not physically dangerous, psychologically dangerous. Because unfinished potential can still feel perfect. Reality cannot. And your brain knows that long before you consciously do. 3. Reframe. This doesn't mean you're incapable of discipline or doomed to quit things forever. In many cases, your brain is trying to protect something fragile. Your imagined identity. Psychologists have noticed that people often become emotionally attached not just to goals, but to the fantasy of who they could become. The imagined self feels safe because it exists beyond proof. As long as the dream stays incomplete, it can still remain idealized. But reality introduces limitation, effort, feedback, imperfection, and suddenly the brain has to confront something uncomfortable. The real version of you may never perfectly match the imagined version. That gap creates emotional friction, so your nervous system tries to reduce the discomfort, not by solving the problem, but by increasing distance from it, which feels like losing motivation. But underneath it, something deeper is happening. Your brain is protecting you from identity disappointment. And once you see that, your behavior starts making much more sense. 4. Psychological mechanism. The human brain is heavily motivated by anticipation. Dopamine, the chemical often linked to motivation, responds strongly to possibility and prediction, not just reward itself. That's why imagining success can feel intensely energizing. Your brain loves open possibilities, because open possibilities contain no final verdict. But once a goal becomes real, the emotional experience changes. The brain shifts from fantasy processing into evaluation processing. Now there are deadlines, results, visible effort, potential failure, and most importantly, evidence. A useful metaphor is this. An unwritten book can still feel like a masterpiece in your mind, but the moment you begin writing actual pages, the fantasy collapses into reality. Reality is always narrower than imagination, and for people with perfectionistic or identity-sensitive thinking, that transition feels emotionally threatening. This creates a mental conflict. Part of you wants growth, another part wants protection from disappointment. So the closer you get to making something real, the more your brain activates avoidance behaviors. Procrastination, numbing, distraction, sudden emotional detachment, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring in a more vulnerable way. The imagined future self was emotionally exciting. The real developing self feels emotionally exposed, and many people unconsciously retreat right there. 5. Practical framework. 1. Expect motivation to decrease after imagination. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming reduced excitement means something is wrong. But psychologically, motivation naturally changes once fantasy becomes reality. For example, you start learning music and feel obsessed for 2 weeks. Then practice suddenly feels boring. That doesn't necessarily mean the passion was fake. It may simply mean the fantasy stage ended and the reality stage began. 2. Separate identity from performance. A major reason progress becomes scary is because you unconsciously fuse results with self-worth. If the project fails, you feel like you failed. If the idea isn't impressive, you feel unimpressive. So begin practicing identity separation. Instead of thinking, this result defines me, try, this is one expression of me, not my total value. Why does this help? Because the brain becomes less defensive when outcomes stop feeling identity-threatening. For example, you post your art online. Some people ignore it. Instead of seeing that as proof you lack talent, you treat it as feedback within a longer process. That emotional separation reduces avoidance significantly. 3. Make goals emotionally ordinary. Sometimes the brain avoids progress because the goal became psychologically oversized, too meaningful, too identity-loaded, so every step feels emotionally intense. The solution is not lowering ambition, it's lowering emotional dramatization. Treat the goal more like maintenance than destiny. For example, instead of saying, this project will prove who I am, approach it as, this is something I practice regularly. This reduces nervous system pressure, and behavior becomes easier when it stops carrying the weight of your entire identity. 4. Finish small things imperfectly. People who lose motivation easily often stay emotionally attached to potential, so your brain needs repeated experiences of imperfect completion, not perfect results. Completion. This matters because unfinished things preserve fantasy. Finished things create reality, and reality builds psychological resilience. For example, write one short piece and publish it without over-editing. Complete one small project even if it feels average. Your brain slowly learns that survival is possible after imperfection becomes visible, and that lesson matters more than temporary motivation. 6. Integration. Maybe you never truly lacked motivation. Maybe your brain simply preferred the emotional safety of imagination, because imagined identities cannot disappoint you. But real identities can. Real progress forces contact with uncertainty, limits, feedback, visible effort, and that's vulnerable. But there's also something quietly freeing about it, because eventually you stop trying to preserve the fantasy version of yourself and begin building a real one instead. Messy, incomplete, human, but real. 7. Quiet, empowering close. There's a reason unfinished dreams can feel strangely comforting. As long as they stay unfinished, they stay untouched by reality, untouched by judgment, untouched by proof. But your life cannot fully happen inside potential. At some point, something has to become real. And yes, real things are imperfect. Real effort is inconsistent. Real growth feels less cinematic than imagination promised. But it's also where identity stops being fantasy and starts becoming experience. So, if your motivation disappears the moment things become real, don't immediately assume you stopped caring. Sometimes it means the dream finally got close enough to matter for real.